Welcome back to the show, everybody. Our guest this evening, making his third appearance ever on the show, but first one since 2019, which, Jim, I know nothing of note has happened since you were last on the show. It's been smooth sailing in the good old US of A. But he's here to talk about his latest book, right? I've got right here, is Last Rites: The Death of American Liberty. That's an awfully ominous title to kick things off with. And I also want to point out, look at these fantastic photographs, both on the front and the back of the book right there, which just do a little bit to set the tone. I'll go ahead and start off right there. Jim Bovard, welcome back to the show.
Hey, Alan, thanks for having me, and thanks for liking those photographs. I had fun taking those shots, especially the one in the back where I'm basically jamming the camera lens and this line of SWAT cops lined up in front of the distant U.S. Capitol in the background is like, nice way to spend a Saturday afternoon in the district area.
Well, I know, being a legendary libertarian muckraker like yourself, you've got the 2021 on the photo in the back. I'm assuming the front one's probably taken around the same time. But as a quick aside before we dive into the meat of the book here, so the front's got the razor wire, the back's got the line of the SWAT police. Can you think of another time in your time moseying around DC that you can remember a sight quite like that?
I can't recall it quite like that. There were some riots and stuff like that. But I mean, it's part of what was fascinating about that barbed wire photo. I was on a hike in March 2021, and had my camera. I was playing around, and I was saying, it was kind of cloudy, and then the sun popped out a little bit, and then voila, I got a decent shot. I was trying to catch the sun on the barbed wire. They had like 10,000, 15,000 National Guard troops around the U.S. Capitol. Was fenced off to keep peasants away, and it was fascinating that there was no controversy about the military occupation of Washington, D.C.
Sure.
You had all these troops, all these armored vehicles, all this, all that, and it was just like, yeah, well, that's how it's supposed to be, and it's funny because there's the old line about whether freedom dies with a whimper, and it's like, there was people in D.C. were fine with it. Most of the folks who I talked to. Now, there's some kindred spirits that had a surly attitude like I did, but it was just amazing how uncontroversial military occupation was.
Well, it's definitely strikes a certain image, but if I had to take a guess, Jim, I would say that a lot of Americans don't see DC as part of America, if that makes a weird sort of sense. Is that so? When I think of the United States, I don't think of Washington DC, because that's not us, that's them. And so to see them surrounded by their troops doesn't really surprise me at all.
So is this tied, since you're from Tennessee, is this tied to your 1860s perspective?
Well, I do tell people you can't slander me by calling me a neo-Confederate, because I don't use the neo part when I'm describing myself. But hold on, this isn't about me. This is about you, Jim. So let me transition here. So Last Rites: The Death of American Liberty, which came out at the end of 2023. Which is, of course, a play on words, but you also wrote a book, Lost Rites: The Death of American Liberty, that was back in 1995. And I'm not going to get on your case that I was only 10 years old when that book came out. But from 1995 to 2023, would you say, you want to talk about the softest of softballs, would you say that things have evolved for the better?
This is going to be like, this is going to be a real knee breaker. Go ahead.
Would you say that you had nothing but glowing reviews about how liberty has improved in those number of years, or the opposite?
Well, there's a lot more federal agencies that put me on their enemies list.
Oh,
I mean, it was after Lost Rites came out that FBI Chief Louis Freeh denounced me, and I guess there's about a dozen different federal agency chiefs that have denounced my work over the years, publicly denounced. Privately is another matter. The Justice Department was covertly emailing USA Today to get my columns there, my op-eds there canceled. So that was always good for morale.
It's nice to be recognized.
Well, it's just sad I couldn't boost my speaking fees because of that. So,
Uh,
um, no, it's sad to look back in the 1990s, and it was practically a golden age of freedom compared to nowadays. There were so many sea changes after 9/11, so many federal agencies that were taken off the leash, and not to mention the worldwide torture regime. And then you had the Supreme Court basically absolving all the torturers, but we still have the rule of law because the Justice Department still has that saying over its entrance: equal justice under the law, or maybe it's buy low, sell high. I don't know what it says.
well, you have this particular zinger here because I clicked on the link that you sent me that had your personal choice of zingers that you're hoping take off just as much as two wolves and a sheep voting. And right off the bat, you have Americans today have the freedom to be fleeced, groped, wiretapped, censored, injected, disarmed, beaten, vilified, detained, and maybe shot by government agents. Oh, now come on, it can't be that bad, Jim.
Well, I said maybe.
This is true. It's not a guarantee.
No, I mean it's an interesting thing. You just go, I was trying to. That's the first sentence of the book actually, and I was trying to get a way to vividly capture the sweep of federal power. And the thing about injected, well, you had Biden's vaccine mandates. You've got so much surveillance going on. You've got so many people have been, you go to the airport and especially especially for people who watch this program online, and that's part of their federal dossier. TSA is going to give you hell.
Yeah. Well, it's funny that you mentioned that because you pack so much into the number of pages that you have in the book. It's by the way, I did look it up. I think there's 25 less pages on last rights than there is lost rights. So apparently we lost so many rights that we lost a chapter of the book. But that being neither here nor there, you do have a whole section talking about guns, Second Amendment, firearms. And I wanted to make sure that we touched on that for a while because one of the things that I noticed on Twitter that kind of sparked that idea in my head of, oh, I got to have Jim Bovard back on, was you are someone in particular that is not allowing the memory of Duncan Lemp to die. And I appreciate you for doing that because you know how the news cycle is, Jim. It's it's harump for 24 hours and then we're on to the next outrage. And I know that in Lost Rights, of course, that being coming out in 1995, you have some fresh material in there about the Waco siege. And then now here we are fast forwarding to Last Rights, and here we are talking about Duncan Lemp. So what's old is new again, of course. So let's talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, Duncan Lemp was a libertarian-leaning pro-gun activist. He was 21 years old. He was, he'd been outspoken online. He had posted photos of him and his guns online, which the government misidentified. But one of the photos he had on Instagram was a photo of his a rifle, and he pegged it to his hometown. And then he had a line in there, something to the effect that green armor-piercing bullets gets the girls wet. And this is a phrase that the local police used to help get a no-knock warrant to raid his house. And so on the day after they got the warrant, 4:42 a.m., you got two teams of police coming up, SWAT teams. One smashes in the front door of the house where Lemp lived in a very affluent area, Potomac, Maryland. It's about 5 or 6 miles from where I live. It's a whole lot more affluent than here. But so you got one team of police going in the front door with a battering ram, and then you had two other cops who went around to the bedroom where they knew the Lemp was sleeping next to his pregnant girlfriend, and the cops did what they call a break and rake. And so you had one cop with a fireman's pike who smashes in the bedroom window and then pulls back the curtains. And then the other cop steps up with his rifle But before that, the cops threw in two flashbang grenades to disorient people and leave them completely confused. Then the cops shot Lemp 3 times, without warning, basically. So Lemp is laying there on the floor, bleeding profusely. His eyes are open. He's looking terrified. And instead of giving first aid, one of the cops comes up and puts his boot on Lemp's throat. Lemp died a few minutes later.
Well, there's so much in that story, and I know that a lot of people covered it at the time, but like I said, unfortunately, things tend to be forgotten when new outrages come along. Now this happened in the state of Maryland. I don't know, because I don't have our friends at the 10th Amendment Center's website up right now, because they do dedicate a fair amount of coverage to legislation being passed on the state level against no-knock warrants. I don't know if anything on that front has been done in Maryland since Duncan Lemp was killed. I know that a number of states have, but one thing I'd like to ask you about is if the legions of our fans on Twitter, and you'll know the ones I'm talking about, are of any indication, it's that if somebody disagrees with someone's politics, then suddenly they don't care if their neck is under the boot of an officer that just gunned them down in their own home. Whereas if it were somebody whose politics they do agree with, or someone who demographically looks or acts more like them, then suddenly there's a lot of sympathy. Now don't get me wrong. I'm not saying that some necessarily deserve less sympathy than others. What I'm saying is that we should sympathize with everyone who finds themselves running afoul of the state. Right off the top of my head, I remember the whole situation with Breonna Taylor, and there was a lot of pushback on what had happened when she was killed. But a lot of the same people who were upset about Breonna Taylor were not sharing that same level of passion for Duncan Lemp, and I find that incredibly tragic.
Yeah, so it sounds like you're going to stick with euphemisms today.
Yeah.
Yeah,
I'm going to try my best.
It was amazing to be. I was amazed at how little interest there was in the Lemp case. There was the Washington Post acted like, well, there was a vilification of Lemp. He was painted as a radical, as an extremist, as a violent extremist, somebody with dangerous ideas. There were a lot of people that were kind of saying, well, someone with those kind of ideas. And he was a gun owner, and we know he was a gun owner. And it's to see how easily so many people shrugged off this pre-dawn killing in a no-knock raid by someone who had not done any violence, who was not making any violent threats, and who was wrongly accused of having an illegal assault weapon, which he did not have. And the state attorney's office issued a report 7 8 months later and said, well, it turns out on further examination that the rifle he had, we thought was illegal. Turns out it was legal, but never mind, no loss. And it was treated like a paperwork error when you use that to smash in the window and gun somebody down before dawn. I'm just amazed at the lack of interest in this case, and I sure as I had a lot of strikeouts with this when I was submitting articles on it. A lot of places, Irish need not apply. In some of the well, I'll try and be polite here, but no, it was amazing to see. I mean, this is done just outside, handful of miles from the nation's capital. National media centered here, and it's just like all that mattered was that Lemp had supposedly had bad ideas and he owned guns, and so the government gets the benefit of the doubt. This is part of the reason so many people distrust both the media and the government, because you get a case like this and you have zero liability for the police, and this is something that the local politicians never commented on. But as soon as George Floyd was killed up in Minneapolis, a number of the county council members spoke out, well, this is terrible and it's an outrage. They had, but they totally ignored the Montgomery County Police under their own jurisdiction. basically because some killings don't count. So.
Well, I know that you use the phrase. Make sure I'm getting this right. Impunity democracy, right? That's the phrase that you use. That since these officials, you talk about in Limp's case that 7-8 months later they're going to say, oh well, perhaps we got some of the facts scrambled, but hey, what's done is done, right? You can't. No point in crying over spilt milk. But since these people ultimately really don't suffer any consequences for their actions. It's hard to imagine that things like this won't continue to happen.
Yes, that's putting it very nicely, Alan.
Yeah, I'm doing really good here. I'm trying to watch my language. This is a family program after all, Jim.
You're trying to sound so reasonable. It's been a long time since I was on your show, and you really changed the tone. My God, there was a line that Mercedes Limp, Duncan Limp's mother, said to me about a year after her son was killed. She said that she had the impression that the police never intended to arrest him, that they were planning to kill him from the start. And it was unfortunate that for the county police, it was easier to shoot Limp than to talk to him, because it would have been easy to stop him and question him and say, okay, there's a search warrant we have for your house. They didn't do that. They just smashed in the window and started shooting, and and they got away with it so far.
Well, to kind of put a final note on that before we take a commercial break is that I think this is also one of many examples that you could cite where, we live in such a binary left, right, black and white society where if you're against things like that, what happened to Duncan Limp or Breonna Taylor, then there are elements that would say, oh well, you're soft on crime, you're anti-police. That means, oh, you want to defund the police. All of a sudden we're going to have spikes in crime, and vice versa. If you are a thin blue line supporter, then it's, oh well, the police, of course, thank you for your service, and everyone needs to be stopped and frisked on every street corner. And of course, obviously, there's what's unfortunate about that. There's no room in the middle, right? If you were to listen to these talking heads in the media, then you would think that those are the only two positions you can have. It's wipe out all policing in America or Nazi Germany. There's just nowhere in the middle. Whereas I think the more sensible position would be to say that, well, it is desirable to have safe communities, but obviously just having nothing more than having security forces being culpable for their actions, just that one teeny tiny little change could go a long way. But of course, all of our friends in the police unions and everywhere else in Washington and further on are not interested in those types of reforms. Or I know a popular one that a lot of people say online is it's like, well, let's just allow people, let's get rid of qualified immunity, right? Let's allow people to sue in cases like this, and let's tie the police pension fund to these lawsuits rather than the city's coffers. Doesn't seem to be a lot of traction for those things in DC.
No, it's surprising that there hasn't been something as simple as getting rid of qualified immunity, which is basically a totally perverse doctrine that the Supreme Court pulled out of its backside, that basically gives police a license to kill, among other laws that have been perversely interpreted. So no, I mean that's a real I think getting rid of qualified immunity would help. It would not be a panacea. But to see how prosecutors can simply absolve police and with a half-ass or no investigation when there's a dubious killing, I mean, this is appalling. And this has been going on a long time. It's funny. I was talking with someone recently, and they were talking about, well, these no-knock raids are I hadn't heard about them before. I said, well, shit, I wrote about that for Playboy 30 years ago. And it's like, it's been an outrage for a long time. It's gotten worse, but I'm supposed to have a positive spin here. I don't.
No, that's all right. Well, we've got the whole next segment to come up with our positive spin. So speaking of pulling it out of our backsides, we're going to be back with more from Jim Bovard. We are joined once again by our friend Jim Bovard, whose latest book right here, Last Rites, The Death of American Liberty. Now, Jim, I know that you have an extensive section on censorship, which I think is a particularly good section for you because I failed to mention this in your introduction. I think it would be easier to list places that you haven't had an article published rather than places that you have been published. So for a guy that has had his works in pages all over America and in tons and tons of huge outlets that I know the audience would recognize, on the censorship front, we'll start with just you personally. Now, I know in that last segment you had mentioned, hey, I'm writing, and the killing of Duncan Limp is something that I'm passionate about. I think this is something people should hear about, but you're not getting a lot of takers. But not just that topic specifically, but for any topic. Would you say that is a problem that you've run into more and more often, more recently than you would have, say, 20, 30 years ago?
That's a coin toss. I mean, the American media has become more cowardly and more deferential to government. Back when I was first starting out, there were a number of newspapers I'd write for that really enjoyed how my articles would get people riled up. They had all these angry phone calls, all these outraged letters to the editors, like, yeah, they have my stuff on their pages, and the phone lines light up. At some point, maybe in the mid-late 90s, especially after 9/11, the appetite for controversy greatly decreased. I think a lot of papers, and there were even to something as simple as having a federal agency attempt to attack an article. I mean, there was a time where editors viewed that as catnip. And whereas in recent times, some editors feel like, damn, what did we do wrong? And I'm thinking, what the hell did journalism schools do wrong? But it's interesting on the censorship stuff. I mean, there's been a sea change among the media in that they've rolled over for so much federal censorship. If you see how most of the media covered the COVID-19 pandemic, the lockdowns, the vaccine mandates, the school shutdowns, all the mask mandates and stuff like that. It was almost as if the media felt like that they had been conscripted to be cheerleaders for any government dictate, no matter how idiotic it proved to be.
Well, it's funny. So literally, as we're sitting here having this conversation this week, the diversity hire in the Supreme Court made comments this week that I see you grinning, so you're probably aware of, where she had said in regards to the First Amendment that she believed that the First Amendment should be reworked or at least reevaluated because it, quote, hamstrings what the government is able to do. Now, she said those words unironically as, well, how could this be? This can't be right. Imagine that. And, something in the Bill of Rights would hamstring the government, and that would confound a Supreme Court justice.
Well, but, you have to give her credit because she explained that the government needs to have some type of ability to censor social media because, for instance, as she said, there might be a national epidemic of teenagers jumping out of windows, jumping out of high windows and hurting themselves or killing themselves. And so the federal government needs to be able to censor the social media to stop all the teenagers from jumping out of windows. You think I'm joking, don't you?
No, I
joking, don't you?
Yeah. I can, Jim, I can only read so much into what these people say and do before I have to shut it out. So you'll probably know more than me. But speaking of social media, so it's a brave new world out there right now. We didn't have when Lost Rights came out. We didn't have Facebook and Twitter or X, excuse me, to our X/Twitter friends or TikTok.
Yeah, folks read books back then.
Yeah.
Folks read books back then. It was long ago.
Well, so what is your opinion on that then? I know that this is kind of a broad little bit of a segue here, but I think a lot of it from a legalese standpoint, and I'm not a blood-sucking lawyer, so forgive me, but from a legalese standpoint, it's how do we handle, and of course, when I say we, I'm talking about the lizard people. How do the lizard people handle social media? Because are these just communication platforms, or are these publishers? Should they fall under certain legal restrictions? The way, do we treat Facebook or Twitter the way we would treat the New York Times? How do you weigh in on that, or do you think that that's just a lot of bluster for we don't like the ones that don't parrot the regime narrative, and we do like the ones that do?
Well, that's the question would tie into Section 230, a federal provision that gives immunity pretty much to social media for the stuff that's posted there by third parties. I think that's a fair assessment. And what the Biden folks were doing was forcing Twitter and Facebook to kowtow by threatening to pull that Section 230 immunity that would make them liable for anything that anybody posted, which would basically guarantee them being financially destroyed. So I don't know. I don't know what the perfect legal structure is for this. I think some of the status quo is good because it means that people. Okay, for instance, I can go on Twitter, and so there was I had some fun yesterday with that comment from Justice Jackson on that she was worried that the First Amendment could hamstring the federal government. So so I quoted that and said, "Oh Lordy," and someone replied, "You Nazi pile, steaming." Pile of shit. So, and I was thinking, is that defamation? No, maybe it's accurate. So now, I mean, folks mouth off, and it's like, it's fine. I mean, it's just, and there's, I've seen a lot of defamation of me online by kind of casual comments like that, but it's like, this is how the game is played these days. And you need a thick skin, and you need to also be able to mock folks who say something really stupid. Because the thing I did with that comment is bracketed and said that Justice Jackson has finally found a worthy defender.
Well, on that note, I happened to catch your appearance on the Tom Woods show a few months back. And one of the topics that you guys got into, beyond just talking about tons of bureaucracy and alphabet agencies and all that, and I thought about this just now when you were talking about being the victim of defamation, is you have all of these regulations that then in turn spawn literally hundreds of thousands or millions of lawsuits. And one of the questions that was just rattling around in my head while I was listening to you and Tom talk was, it seems that the perverse incentive here is, or to put another way, this is why we can't have nice things, is that of course, you or I would think, well, I'm not going to call my lawyer because somebody called me a bad word, or what were the examples that you had talked about? Oh, the coat rack is a few inches too high, I can't reach it, or what have you. But unfortunately, we live in a society where a lot of people would, in fact, take advantage of those types of regulations in order to file suits against people. Do we live in a lawsuit happy world, Jim?
Yeah, there was, I'm sad to say that may be the case. One of my favorite examples, you mentioned the flood of lawsuits. The Americans with Disabilities Act is so broad and vague, it's generated over 500,000 lawsuits. One of my favorite examples was there was a deaf guy who sued Pornhub for violating his rights because most of the videos on Pornhub do not have closed captions. So it's really hard to understand what's going on, unless you get that dialogue. I mean, a lot of that dialogue is Shakespearean, People just have to, give them credit.
We only watch it for the plot. Absolutely.
There you go.
Oh my goodness.
True story. True story.
Well, and a great example to use, but I think, obviously, beyond just the obvious problem that those things shouldn't exist at all, is the fact that, we know that federal bureaucracies, They don't really like in the case of the ADA, American Disabilities. I'm not so sure that anyone at the federal government is really here to help. I know that that comes as a shock to the audience, but I'm afraid that they don't actually care about Americans with disabilities at all, but rather they are justifying their own existence.
Well, I think some of them do care and some of them do try to help, but federal agencies tend to like expansive regulations. And a huge trouble you have with the Disabilities Act is it's basically glommed on to the psychiatrist DSM, Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, with all these new definitions of mental illnesses. So at this point, you've got like 20 or 30% of college students claiming to have some type of mental or emotional disability, so they don't have to take the test, or they get twice as long to take the test, or they get to take the test home and work on it. And you have all these advantages that are being given, and it's also unfortunate because what that law has done, it's turned disabilities into legal assets, and it's a very perverse incentive. Having said that, there are some people who need help. Some people were bona fide handicapped, but I mean, you've had so many nonsensical claims that it muddies the water.
Well, speaking of money being the water, one of the topics we'll wrap up with this one. Of course, the last time you were on the show was November of 2019, and so it was a few months after that there was, of course, this unknown virus of unspecified origins that viciously attacked the Western world. In fact, we had our episode 100. We do an annual event, and we had one for episode 100, and it was in March. It was in March of 2020, and we had people flying in from all over the country. It was a super spreader event before they had invented that terminology.
Okay.
And then within a week of that event, of course, people were saying, "Oh, well, it's a good thing I got back out of town when I did, because I don't think I would have been able to get a flight because there's all these
Right. Yeah.
shutdowns, all these things going on." And so I think something that has really been brought to the forefront, maybe not right away, but at least in the months and years since, is exactly the money line that you used right there. That we're led to believe that there's all of these experts and scientists who are all testifying that, oh yes, this is a threat. These are the countermeasures that should be used. Don't worry about whether or not this flies in the face of 100 years of established science. Trust us, we know what we're talking about. And wouldn't you know, funny thing that the doctors and scientists who disagreed were of course vilified and thrown out of their professions. And the ones who did agree not only were celebrated, but nine times out of 10, you come to find out, well, they're getting their paychecks either directly or from grants via the federal government. That has to just be a coincidence, I'm sure.
Well, it's like there was an old saying: no matter how cynical you get, it's not enough to keep up.
Well, that describes us.
So, and that's about the best way to look at federal policy. I mean, especially for the pandemic. I mean, it was interesting living in the D.C. area during that time, because something I've always done for many years is go out and hikes on the weekend. So I kept doing that. So I'd be walking on the trail, Canal Trail, towpath, and there'd be these other folks coming the opposite direction. People would literally start screaming and cussing at me because I wasn't wearing a mask. And so I just simply tell them, "Hey, tell it to your therapist. You know, I'm sorry you're upset, but we're outside. And by the way, don't get too close. Don't get too close." So,
Well, Jim, on that note, I was going to say I'd love to join you for a hike if I'm ever up that way, but I can't imagine why I would ever leave the objectively superior southern part of the U.S. I think instead you should come down to visit us.
sounds good.
Yeah.
I appreciate the invite.
Jim, where can people go to support you and check out more of your content?
Okay, jimbovard.com. I've got a bunch of books on sale on Amazon. And thanks very much for your kind words on last rites. I think people are getting a lot of laughs out of that, as well as, they might need some blood pressure medicine afterwards. Yeah, I'm doing a lot lately for New York Post. I was on deadline with them this afternoon. So writing about that censorship case. And it's like, oh my, you think it was bad, you don't know half of it.
Well, as they always say, you think you hate these people enough, but you don't. You don't hate them enough. Jim Bovard, thanks for coming back on the show, buddy.
Hey, thanks a lot, Alan.